the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, which has tracked anti-Semitism for many years, reports a 36% increase in anti-Semitic incidents in 2016 compared with the year before, and 89% in 2017, which gives you a sense of the rise, and particularly in California, New York, New Jersey, Florida, Massachusetts. In other words, in the states with the highest Jewish populations, we've seen an increase. What I think, for those of us in education, what has been particularly distressing has been the many anti-Semitic incidents within educational institutions. Of course, we now know, those who read it today, that even the most recent Florida incident has very strong anti-Semitic components. And one suspects that students are repeating sentiments heard from parents. So, for example, elementary school student in Massachusetts performs the Nazi salute, tells Jewish classmates she believes Jews are an inferior species. Georgia, Hitler did the world a favor. New York College, someone leaves graffiti which reads, Jews are a pest. Hitler was right to kill them all, and so on and so forth. Material that we had not heard for some time. Yes, anti-Semitism had moved down, and in a very recent period has moved up again. The most significant new development in anti-Semitism has, of course, been electronic media. And it's all clouded in anonymity and can reach tens of thousands of people. Somebody did a study of this. I can't tell you how you count it, but they concluded that 382,000 anti-Semitic posts were posted to social media platforms in 2016, which they reckoned was 43.6 posts an hour, one post every 83 seconds. And the impact of this tweeting is quite significant. I suspect that this story now about Russian trolls will teach us more about what's going on and how it works. But some of you undoubtedly saw Jonathan Wiseman, a New York Times reporter. He sent out a tweet of an article on the rise of fascism and received replies from people who encased his name in triple parentheses. That's the new symbol of by right-wing anti-Semites of Jews. And he then gets what he describes as a tsunami of hate. My face superimposed on corpses in Auschwitz. Pictures of my head being cut off by ISIS. The image of a smiling president in Nazi uniform flicking the switch on a gas chamber containing my photoshopped face. And that latter image, which is so traumatic, especially to those who lost relatives in the Shoah, shook up actually any number of Jews in the months prior to the election. We need to recognize that kind of picture is exactly equivalent to the lynching noose for blacks. It's the same kind of symbol, and both have risen in recent years. It's an unforgettable image that evokes history's darkest memories and strikes terror in the heart of any recipient. And in addition to all of that, there have also been a rash of bomb threats. My own university got one. 8 of those threats were traced to a former journalist trying to target his girlfriend. Some, including the one at Brandeis, remain unsolved. The majority, and according to the FBI, may be responsible for 2,000 different incidents around the world, turned out to be one individual, a young, probably mentally unbalanced Israeli Jew living in Ashkelon, who allegedly, this is all alleged, but comes from a lot of sources, ran a high-tech bomb scare business. Yes, bombs are us, or staging incidents for $30 a pop. You don't want to take an exam, $30, a bomb scare can happen. Now, I tell you that story, and there's probably more to that story that will come out when he's eventually tried, and there are a lot of questions unanswered. But it reminds us, and this is what's important, that in this new world of social media, a tiny number of people, maybe even one person, can spread a tsunami of hate and spread a great wave of mayhem. Anti-Semitism in the 30s, which was the peak, 20s and 30s peak of anti-Semitism, that required a whole army of haters. Today, one individual can truly terrorize thousands of people. And of course, that leads to a debate. Some people say, actually, what's going on now is much ado about nothing. It's not a real danger, they say, but rather a reflection of new technology. In other words, the number of hate mongers has not grown. Only the reach of the hate mongers has grown. Individuals who once had to send out a letter and make a crank call can now spread their message to thousands, if not millions, of people. So you've got a debate here, and it's the oldest debate, even on American anti-Semitism. It's a debate, really, between a group we might call the maximizers and a group we might call the minimizers. The maximizers insist that anti-Semitism is not only ever present, but also growing. The minimizers, cast doubt on defense organization statistics and insist that anti-Semitism is an exaggerated and declining threat. And that debate you can trace really for a very long period of time. The earliest scholars of American anti-Semitism around World War II, they were minimalists. They argued that anti-Semitism was a late, an alien phenomenon in this country. They linked it to the rise of scientific racism. I presume people know the very word anti-Semitism comes from scientific racism. No longer was a liberal person anti-Jewish or opposed to Judaism. Now the new science in the late 19th century was race. Some races were better than others, and they considered it good science to be anti-Semitic, meaning the Semitic race, because the Anglo-Saxon race or the Teutonic race was clearly superior, and the fear was that any mixing of those races would inevitably lead to a decline of the species. If you ever want to know about the thinking that underlay anti-Semitism, just look at our view of the pedigree of dogs, where, remember, the marriage of two different species yields a mutt. Some species are better, some species are worse. All the ideas of scientific racism are preserved in dogs. They haven't disappeared in the larger society related to people, but they're not respectable anymore, thank God, in the academy. Um, the person who is credited, by the way, for the term anti-Semitism it began in Germany, was Wilhelm Marr. Um, and the argument of these minimalists who began the study of anti-Semitism was that there actually hadn't been anti-Semitism in America, they said, until the late 19th century. A foreign import it was. And if we only return to the virtuous ways of America's ancestors, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, anti-Semitism would cease. By the time we get to the 60s and 70s, there's a kind of opposite, I would call it a maximalist interpretation of anti-Semitism that's developed, influenced probably by the study of racism in America, which begins to be seen as a phenomenon that goes back, to the earliest days, Columbus. And they insisted that, well, just as racism was endemic to American society, so too anti-Semitism. It stalked the length and breadth of American society from colonial to the present. And indeed, there were a few books that argued that, the Holocaust could have happened in America as well. Had, let's say, Henry Ford, a notorious anti-Semite, been elected president, there was a thought of his running, who knows what would have happened. Today, it's easy to show that manifestations of anti-Semitism can be found throughout the history of Jews in this country, dating back to their earliest arrival in 1654. You remember Peter Stuyvesant, those of you who were at my first talk here, had very negative things to say about the Jews who arrived. And every kind of prejudice found in Europe, including blood libels, we'll come back to that, expulsions, murder, has some counterpart in the United States. In other words, if you search hard enough, you can find it. No place is exempt, no era is exempt. But it's worth remembering that Jews have also enjoyed thoroughly harmonious relations with non-Jews throughout their time in America. It would be easy, I wouldn't get as many people, to give a session on philo-Semitism in America, love of all things Jewish and so on. It's very much philo-Semitism, love of Jews, people who wanted to be like Jews, evangelicals or other Christians who had Jew envy, in a sense. Easy to find that in the American setting. So anti-Semitism is part of a very complex narrative concerning the position of Jews in the United States. Ambivalence is a very good word to use in thinking about how Americans respond to Jews. Conflicting emotions, changing experiences, divergent influences. People are pulled in different directions. So sometimes the lure of the exotic and opens door to Jews. Yes, there are wonderful stories of, in the 19th century, of how people would ride for hours just to look at a Jew, one of God's chosen people. One of them claimed he walked round him and round him. He was very disappointed. You look like every other person. But sometimes, as was also, of course, true with Asian immigrants, the lure of the exotic gave way to fear of the unknown. When there are few Jews, that's very exciting. Let's go see them. When there are a lot of Jews, how can we limit their numbers? We're afraid of them. They're changing the country. And that's true. I mean, that would be true. If there's one white tiger, everybody goes to the zoo to see it. Imagine if there were thousands of white tigers, what we would do. But it's true of many other groups besides Jews that the lure, the exotic, gives way to the fear of the unknown. A second and even more powerful source of ambivalence, great, even relevant, I think, today, is a pervasive tension in American life between the mythical Jew, that cursed figure of Christian tradition deeply embedded in Western culture, and the Jew next door who seemingly gives the lie to every element of the stereotype. You can then see a series of well-publicized events, the lynching of Leo Frank, the ravings of Henry Ford. There was a blood libel in Messina, New York. You had Father Coughlin. They had some nice clips of Father Coughlin. And remember, in the 1930s, when radio began, there were very few on the radio, and Father Charles Coughlin was really the first great religious figure to master radio. There were a small number of networks. Millions and millions of people heard Father Coughlin, and his anti-Semitic ravings had a huge impact and really last until he is silenced finally after Pearl Harbor. But I do remind you, the same period sees the rise of the interfaith movement. We see a great increase on the number of Jews in college campuses, in government, cooperation between Jews and non-Jews in areas of social service. So one wants to look at both sides. There's anti-Semitism, but that's never the full story. What I want to do now, it's exactly 3 o'clock, so I'm on schedule. I actually want to read with you some anti-Semitica from the American Committee for the Unfortunate Truth about our Jewish brothers. What? Well, wait, you got to tell me that. That's my next question. I picked it up. I was given a copy in 1980 when it was distributed on the streets of Cincinnati. But it didn't take me long to figure out that it wasn't written in 1980. So first of all, what is this? This is a blood libel. If you've never seen a blood libel in your life before, you're a virgin no longer. Jews need to know what a blood libel is. A blood libel is this: the idea that Jews use blood usually around Passover. Not all blood libels are Passover, but usually the argument is that Jews need blood for their rituals, and watch your children. Now, many of us believe and were taught that, when there's smoke, there's fire. So that if people have believed for hundreds and hundreds of years that Jews need blood, there must be something to it. I presumably do not have to tell this audience that actually there's never been blood used in matzah. It would be a violation of all Jewish law. There's no evidence that any Jew ever engaged in this. So why do we have blood libels? Why are they so pervasive? What do we learn from them? It turns out it's not so easy to murder people. But, I mean, if you have a rifle and so on, but if you dehumanize people, then it's easy. If I dehumanize you, you are using children's blood. First you're slaying them and then you're eating them, then it's easy to kill you. So dehumanization of the other is absolutely crucial to any kind of hatred. And I mean, in the same way, from a Christian, yeah, ye slayed our Lord. Well, that's a good reason to go after them. And here we are seeing dehumanization, and I believe that's what blood libels are heavily about, to dehumanize Jews, making it therefore possible to hate and kill them. There are still Jews who believe you should, there are two views. One is you should have white wine because then, of course, it will be clear it's not blood. And the other view is you should have red wine to prove that God protects us. Leil Shimurim. It's the night when God protects us, and notwithstanding our knowledge of what some people think, we take red wine. I don't think the average American Jew, when they think about what wine they have on Seder, thinks about that issue. But in Europe and in some places, this is America, there was that fear of what your neighbors imagine. Now, so that was the first matter. What is a blood libel? And now Claire had asked earlier, how do I date this document? One thing I noticed, excellent, was it said Cincinnati 23 in 1980. Of course, we already had zip codes, so I knew it was older, but I actually was able to date it quite precisely. Pesach falls, as you know, we're quite amazing Jews. The Jewish holidays for thousands of years were either early or late, but never once been on time. It's like some people. But it turned out that April 16th to 23rd is relatively rare. One of the years when it fell was 1938, and there is a reference to a book on Jewish ritual murder by a man named Leese that's copyrighted in 1938, and so there's little doubt that this is 1938, and that, of course, told me everything. 1938, we now know that the Germans invested quite a lot in spreading propaganda to American cities. If you think the Russians are the first people to try and do that, they're not. The Germans funded a lot of propaganda. In many cities, there's a brand new book, read two books about L.A. and how the Jewish community and using JCRC secretly fought that. The story has not fully been told. Cincinnati had a huge German population in over the Rhine, and the address of the Nazis in Cincinnati turns out to be this address on Hamilton Avenue in over the Rhine. This was part of the Nazi propaganda trying to prevent Americans from supporting the Allies and encouraging them to support the Nazis. Much more of it than we realize went on. And those of you who had relatives in Jewish life in the late 1930s, the challenge was, how do you fight this in a moment of great anti-Semitism without drawing attention to yourself? It's not, although many, many books have been written, it's not at all true the Jews did nothing. But they had to do it very quietly. And only now do we begin to see what Jews did and how they fought it. This is part of that literature. What is amazing and frightening and we see it in our own day, this stuff never dies. It just goes into hiding. And so 38 and 80 is 42. Yes, 42 years later, somebody digs it out, makes copies, distributes it. And honestly, much of the anti-Semitica that we are seeing today, I mean, look at the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is being widely distributed throughout the Arab world. It doesn't disappear, even though it's been debunked so many times. Now let's look, I don't know if one is allowed to have a favorite piece of anti-Semitism, but if one could have a favorite piece of anti-Semitism, what you see on the next page would be mine. This is from 1935 from a book called The Jew Deal. The idea was to prove that the New Deal was really a Jewish conspiracy. Jews controlled the government again. I don't know how many of you watched last week the demonstration in Iran against America. Anybody see it? It was on the evening news. But what the evening news did not point out, although it was clear as day to anyone who watched it, you had Donald Trump, and he had a big Jewish star in that, as if to say the Jews and the American government are linked. And that's a larger theme of, someone wrote an article on the theme with a wonderful title, Shylock Meets Uncle Sam. But in contemporary anti-Semitism, the notion that the Jews and the American government are linked is very, very common, and anybody who has been to a third world country has probably seen and heard it. America is a first world capitalist country, and Israel is first world, and Jews are into capitalism, and it's all one big conspiracy. But don't imagine that it's new. In the 1930s, Roosevelt, whom they claimed was really a Jew named Rosenwelt, and by the way, not so easy to respond. I think Roosevelt said something like, I don't have that honor, but you certainly wouldn't want to dismiss it. In any case, the idea was this man who's passed all these new laws and who has brought a lot of Jews into Washington. I saw Washington is now the third largest Jewish community. The growth of the Jewish community of Washington owes an enormous amount to this period of the 1930s and 40s, when the government bureaucracy expanded enormously under the New Deal, and college-trained Jews rushed down to Washington to participate in that. The first period of the growth of the Jewish community of Washington is the Civil War, where again the federal bureaucracy grows, and the second period is this period. Now, let's read a little bit of this. We will not read it all, but I want you to understand how anti-Semitism works. So we begin. We, the American people, sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States and all that it stands for. Does that language, we, the American people, resonate with anyone? What is it? Okay, we, the people of the United States, and so on. That's not accident. What's going on? By using that language, you are trying to create an us-them. We imagine Jews are part of the inside crowd. They are trying to argue Jews are outsiders. There's American people and there's Jews. Just like in Germany, what did anti-Semites say? Deutschtum und Judentum. Jews imagined they were part of Germany, but anti-Semites said, nope, there's Deutschtum, Germans, and there's Jews outside. That's what this is about. And as Sons of the Patriots, 1776, design and reserve the nation founded by George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. Anti-Semites in America have a problem. The problem is it's hard to look back to the good old days when Jews knew their place and so on, as in Europe, because in America there was no emancipation. But what these guys are doing are trying to show that Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and so on really were on the other side. There is a famous forgery. Very recently, I was asked again, people send this stuff to me, a famous forgery in which Benjamin Franklin is alleged to warn Americans about Jews and to attack Jews. It was first unmasked by the historian, this will mean something to a few of you, Charles Beard. Beard, the great historian, he was doing this stuff in the 30s. But I was recently sent a document, the same document. Do I know anything about it? Could it be true? Did Ben Franklin say it? And so forth. Anti-Semites are desperate to link themselves to those figures because that provides legitimacy for views that are otherwise illegitimate. And that's what that is about. And they perpetrate, hereby present the indictment against members of a race. Now, remember what I said? It was supposedly illiberal to attack Jews on the basis of their religion. Race was okay because race is science. Just like in our day, Israel. Oh, I have nothing against Jews. I just have it against Israel. But as we will see here, and in case we run out of time, I'm going to give it away now. When you read further, it's the same old anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism that you always had. In other words, it's only the external, the patina that changes. Similarly, much of, now we see, but Holocaust denial. You read the literature of Holocaust denial and get past the first paragraphs, and it's the same old anti-Semitic that we always had with a new outside cover. And that's what is going on here. Consistently, persistently oppose the doctrines to which American life subsists. One of the things that's hard for students today is to question what's written. It says here they consistently and persistently oppose the doctrines of which American life subsists. Well, I wouldn't want to fight against that. And one of the reasons I want to read this, and I'll have a few other examples, is just because something is written doesn't make it true. And unfortunately, and this is a huge problem today, hate mongers use declarative sentences, broad generalizations, absolute certainty. Professor, oh, it's nuanced, and here, well, it's very hard to respond. And that's part of the problem that we all have in the academy. Yeah, there was one Jew once, and whereas they use this kind of language. And it's very hard for people committed to truth to respond to people who don't share that commitment and are simply making lots of declarations without it. Okay. That they have failed to discard their alliances with members of their race in foreign lands. Very clever wording, evoking George Washington's entangling alliances. Of course, Jews do have ties with people in foreign countries, but you are taking that matter of fact and using it to cast doubt on Jews. Let me read a few others. They're an international people, having never pledged their allegiance to any one nation, which is based on their history that reveals their nomadic tendencies. Um, but the international people is a hint at a very old anti-Semitic forgery that I mentioned earlier, the international Jew. And that notion, by the way, just so we know, today, 80-some% of all Jews live in two countries in the world, and about 85% live in North America and Israel. Since World War II, the very opposite has taken place. We imagine Jews are international, but in real life, Jews live in a very small number of places, and Jews are becoming more and more concentrated. That's the theme of our time. Jews are more and more concentrated in fewer and fewer places. Huge areas of the world have no Jews, which of course explains what. Oh, yeah, they may have a Chabad house, but yeah, you're right. More and more, but that explains why they don't know Jews. They don't know Jews because Jews don't live there, and that's why it's much easier today than ever before for third world nations, for most of the countries in the UN, to believe amazing things about Jews. They don't know any Jews. Then that their international interests have undeniably caused much of the unrest and ill feeling that prevails throughout the world. Beware. What's the word you want to beware of there? Undeniably. Very hard for people. I don't want to deny something. It says undeniably. It takes a lot of courage to question that. And what we're doing here is studying how propaganda works. If you want to see through propaganda, words like undeniably are in the arsenal of propagandists. And it's very important to always focus on a word like that. Note the sense that Jews had started World War I, that their control of international finance, that of course is the elders of Zion. The notion that Jews are one and the same time, and here's what the first of the many contradictions here. Jews are international bankers who control the finances of the world, and they are also social revolutionaries seeking to undermine the stability. They are capitalists and communists. Exactly. And now, the top of the next section is the one that most people, are aghast at, that their race is planning the next Holocaust for the purpose of subjecting the Gentile government of the world to their dominance. Now, of course, this is 1935. The word Holocaust, of course, didn't mean in 1935 what it means today. But if you want to know how people kill Jews, if I think they're planning the next Holocaust for me, what am I able to do? Exactly. And this helps us to understand some of the ideas that were current in extremist circles in America, but surprisingly more than you'd expect, spread out from there. If you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you see their international bankers are backing the tyrannical rule of a communist Jewish minority in Russia. So that's exactly what we were saying. Jews are simultaneously bankers and revolutionaries. They are shaping the order. They are undermining the order. In other words, the word Jew reflects everything you're afraid of. It's a Rorschach test. It tells you more about the fears of the people who write the documents than about reality. That was certainly true of Henry Ford. I don't know if any of you have read The International Jew, which unfortunately is available free on the web. But if you do read it, it tells you a lot about Henry Ford and what he thought was terrible in the world. The world is changing, music and the rise of the cities and all these new textbooks. He liked McGuffey, he preserved McGuffey, and so on and so on, all of which he blames on the Jews. Who changed America more probably than any other individual of his day? Henry Ford. The automobile staged a complete revolution, and it's fascinating to see that. Take a look here. They are preparing to foment another war with Germany to execute the salvation of the Jewish money changers and political racketeers who have been driven out of Germany by Adolf Hitler. Again, we got to see this coded language. This turns Hitler. This is language from where? Money changers. This is from where? Old Teutonic stuff, do you think?
No, it's earlier than that.
It's the New Testament. Jesus and money changers out of the temple. And who is Jesus in this? Hitler. I mean, to us, it's astonishing that Hitler can be cast as Jesus, but that's what that literature did. Jews are not establishing. The last is very interesting, on this page, reminding us of a theme that comes up regularly, that the Jews in America have overstepped their proportionate representation in the government of the United States. That is something one hears a lot in certain sections. There is no proportional rule in America. WASPs are 0.5% of the population, no more than one WASP per 200 legislators. We don't have such a system, thank God, in America. But this language, it was a little hard to respond. Actually, Jews were not, in 1935, even their percentage of Congress. Today, they are more. There are 3 Jewish justices on the Supreme Court, and Jews are more than 2% of Congress. But it's worth always kind of noting that that's not the way the founders set it up as proportionate representation. I'm not going to go through the next page except to point out to you that when you look at they violate and disdain the Sunday tradition, they oppose the Christian basis of our government and so on, we've moved from race to religion. And it's very subtle, but it always happens or in this kind of literature, and I wanted you to see that. And then we get to the very end, which is the point. Judaism is the antithesis of Americanism, and that's what they were trying to show, an us-them, and it's precisely what one should never allow. Both cannot survive in the same nation. If Americanism is to remain with us, the Jewish problem must be solved. If you go, those of you who have access to an old library catalog, you'll be amazed that there are many listings under the term Jewish problem. Of course, it wasn't a Jewish problem. It was a non-Jewish problem. Eventually, in the 40s or 50s, the American Library Association ended that category, but it's really quite fascinating to see why the term Jewish problem was. I promised to close with a few ways in which it seems to me that notwithstanding, I don't want to end on a negative note, notwithstanding, I want to close with a few ways in which seems to me that the history of anti-Semitism has in fact been different in America than in Europe. I don't aim either to maximize or to minimize anti-Semitism, but history and context and place matter when we study these phenomena. So number one, and very important, in America, Jews have been able to fight back against anti-Semitism freely. And I could trace Jews fighting back from before the American Revolution to the present. Jews were not worried in America that they'd take emancipation away from them. Those of you who were with me when we studied George Washington's letter, that's why I insisted. George Washington says religious liberty is an inherent natural right. You can't take inherent natural rights away. And Jews were not worried in the way that they very much were worried in many other countries that, if we fight back too hard, we'll lose our rights. So you see Jews using their freedoms to fight back. Even Chaim Solomon was fought back against anti-Semitism. Chaim Solomon, in the days of the American Revolution, we have an attack on him on an anti-Semite, and amazingly, even presidents who issued things that were insensitive to Jews responded, and that goes back to John Tyler, who succeeded William Henry Harrison, who had, in 1841, Harrison died after a month. He gave a speech, allegedly. He got pneumonia at his inaugural, and Jews responded to Tyler, and Tyler apologized. I didn't mean, I'm glad that you have that you have enlightened me, and so on. And so number two, and this is very significant. In America, anti-Semitism has always had to compete with other forms of animus. It's not the only animus that we have. Well, I mean, we're a great country and very pluralistic, and we're pluralistic in our hatred. Racism, I have a list. Racism, anti-Quakerism, Anglophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Catholicism, anti-Masonry, anti-Mormonism, anti-Orientalism, nativism, anti-Teutonism, primitive anti-common. What a country, yeah. But the point is, hatred has been diffused, and there are two things. Number one, in many countries, Jews were the only outgroup. Of course, that's not true in America. We know that well. And second of all, huge numbers of Americans know that maybe today it's Jews or blacks, someone else, but once it was us. Yes, many German Americans remember World War I. Oh, our parents had to change their name and stop speaking German. Or our Asian Japanese all remember. We were put in camps. So lots of Americans remember and know that they were once the object of malevolence. So American anti-Semitism is a sort of less potent strain than its European counterparts because it has many more competitors. It's got to crowd out. There are competing hatreds in America, and let's be honest, and this was known very well by Abraham Lincoln. In America, you had blacks, and they were the hated out group, and Lincoln understood the Jews were in Europe what blacks were in America, and there's a lot of truth in that, and it still has implications today. The third point, which I've hinted at earlier, anti-Semitism is actually more foreign to American ideals than to European ones. Nobody can read the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence or George Washington's letter and really say, oh, they support anti-Semitism. But if you read the various czars and what they wrote, it's very different. Or in Germany. So American ideals have been something the Jews in America have been able to appeal to in a way that was more difficult in a European setting. And I think the Constitution has been a rather potent weapon in Jews' defense. I'm always surprised when students have never read the Constitution. I'm sure you've all read it, but I encourage you to read it and teach it to your children. We should know it, especially in times like these. Number 4, America's religious tradition. The Great Tradition of American Churches is a book that some of you may know, is inhospitable to anti-Semitism, meaning religious freedom and diversity, church-state separation, denominationalism, the idea that there are many paths to one God, voluntarism, that militates against a kind of us-them dichotomy. It's easy in a document in Germany to say Germans and Jews, Poles and Jews, and so on. But in America, where there's so many different religions and there is no national church, Jews don't stand apart from the national church. Even in England, Jews are dissenters. But in America, most people think, okay, Jews are just another denomination. And that seems very strange, but actually it's been very good for Jews. We are not outsiders. Indeed, most people talk of, in a religion, American Protestants, American Catholics, American Jews, American Muslims, American Buddhists, implying that they all stand as equals in the eyes of the law. And the last point is that our political system, when it works, resists anti-Semitism. The two-party system has historically, I said this in another session, some of you heard it, has historically been a great strength because both parties know they cannot alienate a block of voters. The only people you can alienate are people who don't vote. Yes, when blacks didn't vote, then you could go after them. Non-citizens don't vote. You can go after them. But you were reluctant to go after any block of voters. For most of American history, it's not true today, the politics of hatred was confined to noisy third parties. The Know-Nothings were a typical anti-Catholic party in the 19th century. They were the politics of hatred. George Wallace embodied the politics of hatred. It didn't infect the major parties, which were busy trying to build broad coalitions. In European countries, in Israel, the coalition comes after the election. So I can spew lots of hate before the election, and then we got to get together afterwards to make a coalition. But in America, you make the coalition before the election, and that's actually been very good for Jews. Historically, I hope also in the future, appeals to national unity have won more elections than appeals to American provincialism and bigotry. Now, I don't mean by pointing to American distinctiveness to obscure the fact that anti-Semitism has always existed in America, and as I said at the beginning, it exists, alas, in our day and has risen significantly. And complacency is absolutely a luxury that nobody, no Jew can afford complacency, certainly not today. But at the bottom line is, I don't think we should minimize anti-Semitism. I also do not think we should maximize it or exaggerate it. But past history and the events of our day point to the need for Jews, and indeed, I think, all Americans, to remain eternally vigilant. Thanks very much.